Resuming debate. Reprise au débat. The honourable member for Newmarket Aurora.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's a pleasure to stand up today and talk about Bill C-4. Its purpose, of course, is to repeal the provisions enacted by Bill C-377 and C-525. In other words, Bill C-4 aims to restore fairness and balance to labour relations. Throughout this process, there are some who worried about transparency. In fact, they claim Bill C-4 attacks the transparency to which our government has committed itself. Nothing could be further from the truth. Mr. Speaker, all in this House know that our government is a champion for transparency. We are a government that's transparent, honest, and accountable to Canadians. We adhere to the most stringent ethical standards. Madam Speaker, if we are talking about transparency, it's because this issue is of particular concern with regards to Bill C-377. Some think that the legislation was necessary to improve the financial transparency of unions. They say that it was required to guarantee public access to information on union expenses. However, our government strongly believes that they are mistaken. Rather than improving transparency, Bill C-377 actually created additional privacy issues. Bill C-377 was pushed through Parliament by the previous government despite loud opposition from many different groups, including Conservative and Liberal senators, constitutional experts, and certain organizations such as the Canadian Bar Association. The previous government refused to listen to anyone, which is precisely why they are the previous government. We do things differently. We listen, and our efforts to improve labour relations in Canada were applauded by key stakeholders. The Public Service Alliance of Canada was pleased that our government tabled legislation to repeal Bill C-377 and Bill C-525, which this union believed were designed to weaken unions, are unconstitutional, and are a violation of privacy rights. Madam Speaker, Canada's Privacy Commissioner, Daniel Thériault, himself has expressed concerns with Bill C-377. In his view, publicly listing specific individuals' political and lobbying activities, as well as education, training, and conference activities, in accordance with Bill C-377, is overreaching. Recently, he appeared before the Standing Committee on Human Resources, Skills and Social Development and the Status of Persons with Disabilities, also known as HUMA. And Madam Speaker, I'll take this opportunity to advise the House that I'm splitting my time with the honourable and learned member from Vaughan Woodbridge. Now, if I may quote Mr. Thériault from the committee, "My role is to advise parliamentarians on the consequences that legislative measures can have on privacy. I do not have an opinion on the activities of labour organizations specifically, but, like my predecessor, I have maintained all along that the provisions contained in Bill C-377 and its previous incarnations went too far by imposing a public disclosure requirement. They were unreasonable and infringed on privacy rights." Mr. Thériault continued, "Transparency is not an end unto itself. It cannot be an absolute objective to the exclusion of other considerations. Transparency efforts must be carefully balanced with the need to protect the personal information of individuals." I couldn't agree more. Protecting personal information is something that Bill C-377 simply does not do. To provide my honourable colleagues with more context, this legislation amended the Income Tax Act to require unions to provide the Minister of National Revenue with detailed information on their finances. More specifically, Bill C-377 forces labour organizations and labour trusts, including those under provincial jurisdiction, to provide information returns. These returns would then be made publicly available on the Canada Revenue Agency's website. Bill C-377 requires this information to include financial statements stating the total of all transactions, including certain transactions over $5,000 listed separately. These could include statements on the assets, debts, and expenses, and the salaries of certain individuals. And as if this weren't enough, unions must also provide details on the time spent by certain individuals on political and lobbying activities, and activities not related to labour relations. Worse still, failure to comply with reporting requirements is considered an offence subject to a fine of $1,000 for each day of non-compliance, up to $25,000 per year. Madam Speaker, let me state it clearly. Bill C-377 does nothing to add to the transparency of unions' affairs, and the former government knows this well. To begin with, were this legislation to remain in place, employers would have access to unions' financial information, but the opposite would not be the case. In a collective bargaining process, unions would clearly be put at a disadvantage. For example, in the case of a work stoppage, an employer would know exactly how much money the union had in its strike fund. So it would know how long the union could hold out in the event of a strike. All the employer would have to do is wait out till the strike fund was exhausted. This is unfair, unbalanced, and unreasonable. The union is completely stripped of one of its key bargaining levers. In addition, the strict disclosure requirements apply only to labour organizations and labour trusts. They do not affect other groups that also receive beneficial tax treatment under the Income Tax Act. This practice discriminates against unions and upsets the balance in labour relations across this country. Lastly, provisions are already in place requiring unions to fulfill their financial reporting responsibilities. For example, Section 110 of the Canada Labour Code requires unions and employers' organizations to provide financial statements to their members upon request and free of charge. There are also similar provisions in most provincial labour relations legislation. Bill C-377 does nothing to add to this regulatory regime. The reality is that the vast majority of unions already make their financial statements available to their members. These documents generally contain aggregated financial information and seem to meet the intended objective without it being necessary to name specific names. In other words, it protects privacy. Instead of promoting true transparency, Bill C-377 infringes on the right of privacy. Madam Speaker, we should not force unions to provide detailed information on their finances. That is why steps have already been taken by the Minister of National Revenue to remove these obligations. As a result, during the repeal process, unions and other stakeholders affected by the bill are not required to submit detailed tracking of their activities for fiscal year 2016. Madam Speaker, balance is the key. Yes, we need to be transparent, but we also need to respect privacy. Balance needs to be restored in relations between employees and employers. To that end, I urge all members of this House to support Bill C-4. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires.